We've had just recently 2 Academy Award-winning filmmakers from Hollywood in. We had 2 Pulitzer Prize winners, had the general that ran the war in Afghanistan, and I hosted a joint town hall between the US House and the German Bundestag. So really fun programs. They're all at Lynn. Here's what we have coming up in the next couple days and weeks. Later this month, the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations will be here. She's spearheading the relief in the Ukraine, so I intend to interview her about boots on the ground, what's going on in the Ukraine. Then we have a program on Holocaust awareness. We're going to examine the art, poetry, and music produced in the camps. And we're going to play the music, then I'll talk about them. Read the poetry, I'll talk about it. Show the art, I'll talk about it. And then in March, we have the commander of the International Space Station coming in. This guy is so cool. He was a test pilot for the military, commander of the space shuttle. He's like Chuck Yeager meets Carl Sagan. So 2 of my heroes. So he's really cool. He's fascinating. I love this guy. So all you got to do is call Lynn, ask for the box office. And when you do, just say, when are Dr. Watson's programs? And happy to bring everybody in the community out. We have a lot of seats. And again, they're all free or $15. For the Holocaust program, I have a traveling exhibit from the U.S. Holocaust Museum. I'm going to unveil a new one. So it's all, and that one's all free. And we have food and drinks too. So now you'll be there. Yeah, I know. Well, that's fine. So just call Lynn's box office, some wonderful programs. They're all at our Wald Center, which is our beautiful theater where we hosted the presidential debate. So, okay. Just wanted to announce and invite everyone. So, okay.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Mary Czar. I'm the executive director here at the Boca Raton Historical Society and the Schmidt Boca Raton History Museum. Welcome. Most of you are not members. I know that, and I invite you to please look at these exhibits. If you come back and take a look, you will be immersed in Boca Raton's history, which is super, super interesting and really very impactful, not only for us, but for the whole nation. So take a look. You know, we had some major things that happened in Boca Raton that impacted the whole country. So take a look. We should be all be proud to live in Boca Raton. And following up with Dr. Watson, I want to say we have a couple of things coming up as well. We have a tea time, 2 o'clock in the afternoon on January 24th, which is the history of Lynn University. Okay, nice history, nice story. Back in the 1960s, I guess.
1962.
There you go.
And it was a bunch of nuns who got in trouble with the Catholic Church because they marched with MLK. So we had a nice start. Radical nuns.
They actually marched with our black students during the immigration program, here in Boca Raton. But anyway, and then on February 15th, we have another lecture here just like this one, the Civil War in Florida, and which is very interesting because Florida was here. We were a Confederate state. So I think a lot of people don't realize that. So we have that. And just take a look at our website. We have many programs coming up. But tonight I want to welcome Dr. Watson here to the Boca Raton Historical Society as our next lecturer. But before I give his lecture, we give his bio, I do want to remind you of what's in your seat. We really encourage you to please fill out this survey. I know you don't like surveys, nobody does. It's very quick. But it's important for us, for the county, because we get a major grant from the county. And we have to do surveys for the county.
Yeah, please fill it out. They actually check them out. Yeah,
It's very, very
they check it.
important. Secondly, you have a membership card in your seat. Or if you don't have one, there's some on the back table. Please join us. We do a lot of what Dr. Watson does, but it's very Boca oriented. But let me tell you, Boca's a great place. And it's a great city, and we have great things here. So we welcome you here, welcome you to bring your guests here, and to learn about our community, which is fantastic. So,
don't forget that we are selling Dr. Watson.
Oh yeah, that.
We are selling Dr. Watson's books in our gift shop, which is where you walked in. So if you would like for him to sign a book, please go purchase one after the lecture, and we have a table right here. He's going to be signing some books. So please do that, and then we're ready to introduce our prolific author tonight, who has written 40 books? Holy cow. 40 books and 200 scholarly articles. But as you know, Dr. Robert Watson is all over the place, and he's right here in Boca Raton. We're really proud to have you here.
Thank you.
And proud to have you here at the Historical Society. But this particular topic is super interesting. I can't wait to hear about it. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. You can hear me without the mic, right? I'm loud. I'm loud. If nothing else, I'm loud. Let me up front apologize. I can't button my jacket. I got off. I was lecturing on an Oceania cruise for 2 weeks. I was up 15 pounds and stopped weighing myself. I tried all 5 of my jackets and suits. Nothing fit. So here we are. But at any rate, Robert Watson plus about 20. Thank you. Let me thank Susan and the whole staff here at the Museum and Society. This is a wonderful resource for our community, you would all agree. And the new renovations, this place is lovely. We're really excited about this book for a couple of reasons. One is it got picked up by the History Channel. It's going to be a 1-hour TV show sometime in 2023. And we filmed the interview and everything here at the museum. And super exciting, the narrator for it's Morgan Freeman. So I'm super excited about that. So it'll be out on the History Channel sometime in 2023. Secondly, happily, it won the International Book of the Year in History this past year, so we got lucky. I'll tell you, a couple years ago, this is the second book of mine that's won the International Book of the Year in History. And I was actually traveling on a cruise when they had the event. I was in Europe, so I didn't get to make it. But the last book that won one, I gave what I think is my best speech in my career. They had an open bar, a lot of food, and nobody wants to hear a long speech. We all hate the Academy Award speeches, right? So when it was my time, I got up and I gave a one-sentence speech. And if anyone knows me in the audience, you know it's hard for me to say hello in under an hour. So here's my speech on the first book of the year. I said, I'd like to thank David McCullough for not writing a book this year. Or there's no way in hell I would have won, right? But at any rate, I'm also excited about the book because this is my latest, it's number 47, and I love, my sweet spot is the history that we've missed. And the late great Librarian of Congress, Daniel Boorstin, used to have a rule, that he said it was the 99% law of the unread. 99% of every book ever written in history is gone. Decomposed, burned, lost, destroyed on purpose. Think about it. If we took one of these surveys and set it out here in the grass, and we came back in a couple of months, it would be soil. And yet the paper today is chemically treated, highly processed. Imagine parchment from a couple hundred or a couple thousand years ago, right? And before Ben Franklin invented his lightning rod, everything burned at one point or another. Imagine parchment without a Ziploc baggie, air conditioning, an archive or museum, on the frontier, a sod house. We lost everything. So 99% of the books are gone, which means there's more we don't know than we do know about history by a lot. My corollary to Boorstin's law of the unread is this. Something worse than losing 99% of books is we've lost 99% of the things that breathe life into the human story. The love, loss, triumph, and tragedy. For example, the love letters, the poems, the clothing, the recipes, the musical scores, the games children played. That's what makes the human narrative, the human story so compelling. And we've lost all of 99%, who knows, of that. So the challenge for an historian is to not only work with what we have, but to try to figure out what we're missing. And then to try to find morsels to breathe life into history. If you're like me, you love history, but hated your history classes, and except Victor and Max, who were my students in my history class. You hated your history classes, right, Victor? Right, Max? You like mine. And you hated your history books because what was it? Dry rote memorization, wasn't it? One date after another. And it's like, where are the humans? They take the people out of history. So our challenge, and one thing I love to do, is to try to put the people and the compelling personal narrative back into the history and try to find those stories that we've missed. And in my career, I think I've been blessed. I've come across 3 books that I've written, which are pretty much the only work on the topic, and they're amazingly important stories. And 2 of the 3, I literally stumbled across the documents. We often forget that the process of discovery, more often than not, occurs through dumb luck. And in my case, I'd love to lie and tell you I knew what I was doing, but it was dumb luck. The only thing I did was I was dogged that I was going to find every single thing that was on that, but I stumbled across it by dumb luck. So in a way, history is not unlike paleontology. Paleontology is the study of ancient life, right? Paleontologists would study T-Rex. The problem for the paleontologist, one, the last T-Rex walked this earth 66 million years ago, right? So how do you know how they walked, how they hunted, how they slept, how they mated? And the answer to that would probably be very carefully, right? Sexual dimorphism, the male's usually bigger than the female, but Mrs. T-Rex was a lot bigger than Mr. T-Rex. So very carefully would be the answer. The problem then for a paleontologist is all the soft parts of history, all the soft parts of paleontology, like what I said, the letters, the poems, the musical scores, it's gone. We don't know what color T-Rex was, because skin is a soft tissue, it decomposes. Were they brown, green? That's the guess, because alligators have that kind of color, right? Maybe they had spots, maybe they had stripes. Didn't a lot of apex predators, and today a lot of apex predators have spots or stripes? And T-Rex was huge. They needed something to hide, right? Can't hide behind a palm tree if you're a T-Rex. Maybe they had feathers. Their hip structure is identical to the bird today, probably their closest descendant. We don't know. We don't know what T-Rex smelled like because it's decomposed. We don't know what color T-Rex's eyes were. We don't know what they sounded like. Spielberg in Jurassic Park guessed that they probably sounded like a train, which I guess that's close enough. We don't know because the throat, the esophagus is all decomposed. So paleontologists have to figure out a T-Rex by only the hard parts of history: a tooth, a claw, and a dried footprint in the Cretaceous mud, right? The same way we have to figure out history based on only hard parts: a cannon, a crown, a castle, that kind of thing. So it requires an enormous amount of work, and we have to dig and dig and dig, and that's exciting. So I wanted to just open this by talking about a project that really juiced me to try to dig into this project. It's called the Nazi Titanic. And in 47 books, this was the hardest one I've ever written. It was more difficult than the other 46 put together. And I've already resigned myself that in my life, I'll never, ever come across anything or do anything remotely as interesting or as important as this. I've already given up. So what it was I wanted to write a book on World War II, and I wanted to write a book on the Holocaust. So I figured I'd do them in that order: WW2, then one on the Holocaust. The problem is entire forests have been felled to fill the pages of books on World War II and the Holocaust. And I don't want to just remine the old territory, right? I wanted to find something new. So I spent years and years just pondering while I was writing other books, what could I write that's unique? What have we missed? And then it dawned on me. We missed one of the most important things of the entire war and Holocaust: the last week in Europe. Now, the last week in Europe is chaotic. Everybody's racing to Berlin. The Nazis don't record everything because they're too busy dying, committing suicide, running for their lives, and getting captured. The British are too busy racing to Berlin, and the Red Army, the Soviets, are too busy destroying everything and killing every man, woman, child, and farm animal in their path. I mean, it's a swath of devastation. So that last week is chaotic, and I thought, that's what we'll write about. So what I did is I wanted to start on April 30th, when Hitler committed suicide. Cyanide, right? Bullet in the head, body burned in the Reichsgarden. The trifecta, the hat trick. So with Hitler committing suicide on April 30th, and I wanted to go a week-ish ahead to the end of the war in May in Europe. And I thought I'd make each day a chapter and tell one story of love and one story of loss. Because the end of World War II, one of the problems I think with history books is the Civil War, World War II, the Holocaust, these topics are so big, you can't get your brain around them. I think we have to drill down and just try to find compelling stories that we can all relate to. So I thought, all right, we'll write a story about, against all odds, a couple got out of two camps and were reunited. Against all odds, a baby was born. Who was the commandant that did one final despicable act? And there were acts when literally, as the Allies were charging, they were still shooting the last people instead of running for their lives or fighting back. Was there a commandant that had one shred of humanity at the end of the war? Get it? That's what I was doing. And while I was looking for that, those crazy stories, I stumbled across a letter by a major in the British Army. His name was Noel Till. Noel Till. And Noel Till wrote that what he saw on the Baltic coast, north-central Germany, southern Baltic, was the most horrific thing he's ever seen in his life. He said thousands and thousands of POWs and Holocaust survivors died in the most gruesome manner ever. And I thought, what is he talking about? So I called the U.S. Holocaust Museum. I called the World War II Museum in New Orleans. I called the Imperial War Museum in London. I called Yad Vashem. I said, what is this event? And they all said it didn't happen. And I said, I didn't think so. But I set the letter aside, but I couldn't forget it. And I go back to my original idea for a book, which I never wrote, because I found this. And by dumb luck, a second time, I found another letter. This is from a general named Mills Roberts, British general, 6th Commando. That's like our 82nd Airborne, so badasses. And Mills Roberts spends a career in uniform as a general. And he writes that he was there on the Baltic coast and watched thousands and thousands of people die, and he will never forget this nightmare. A blood and guts career general. So I thought, what was it he saw? So I called everybody back again. I called scholars of the Holocaust, scholars of World War II. Everybody said nothing happened. I said I didn't think so. But 2 letters, if you need somebody to change the oil in your car, don't call me. You know, I'm illiterate when it comes to mechanical things. If you have really old letters and you need someone to figure them out, I'm your guy. That's about all I'm good at, right? So it's what I do for a living. So the letters seem legitimate to me. So what I do is I figure out, I'm going to solve this riddle on my own. So I get Major Till's unit. If anybody had a family member in World War II, you can contact your member of Congress or the Pentagon, and they'll tell you all the battles they were in and what happened to the unit. Casualty counts, awards, citations. It's a great service. And I've hooked up World War II vets and their families countless times with the Pentagon to do that. So I do it myself, and here's Major Till's unit. I follow them the whole way through the war. It gets to the very end of the war, and all the records disappear. I'm like, oh, right? So I get General Mills Roberts. There's his unit. I follow them the whole way through the war. Were they at the invasion in Sicily? Were they at D-Day? Were they at, the Battle of the Bulge? I get to the very end of the war, and guess what? It disappeared. So I thought, A, it's either the world's worst coincidence. B, they were abducted by aliens, but we don't traffic in that, right? C, they're classified. So long story short, I'm contacting the Royal Archives in London, begging them to get access to this, and they keep saying there's nothing there. And I said, how do you know? You just answered me. At least call me in 2 days and lie, right? So I'm frustrated. I'm spending weeks, I'm sending them information. I'm literally calling them saying, don't hang up. I'm not a crazy person. I just emailed you my bio or I mailed you one of my books. I couldn't get them to even talk to me. So I get a great gig lecturing on the beaches of D-Day for the 70th anniversary. And I'm walking along the beach and I meet a woman there who's about my age, which is to say, extremely youthful, 60, okay? And she is smart, attractive, accomplished, fascinating. I'm blown away by her. Turns out she's an Academy Award-winning filmmaker in Hollywood. She's on the board of the Holocaust Museum. She's friends with Prince Charles, Dame Judi Dench, Sir Attenborough. And she tells me about one of her movies. It's The Kindertransport. It's called Into the Arms of Strangers. Won the Academy in 2001. And I said, oh, I've shown that to my students. They cry. I love it. And I said, wow, can I have dinner with you tonight in France? I said, I hope you don't mind. My family's along. She said, no, I hope you don't mind. My family's along. So I did a distinguished lecture series for FAU, right? For years with hundreds of people, a couple thousand down here. And there was a couple named Eric and Gloria Oppenheimer, a Holocaust survivor and a World War II vet, who sat in the front row every week for 10 years. So I'm waiting at the restaurant for this Hollywood filmmaker to walk in, and in comes Debbie Oppenheimer and her parents, Eric and Gloria. And I'm like, Eric and Gloria, what on earth are you doing here? They said, we're here for your lectures on D-Day. I'm like, you have to get out a lot more socially. You hear me every week, right? And then I looked, I'm like, wait a minute, Oppenheimer, Debbie, this is your daughter, the Academy Award? So I said, what kind of Jewish mother are you that you didn't tell me your daughter won the Academy? If my kids won the Academy Award, I'd be giving out T-shirts with that on the cover, right? I mean, and then Debbie looks at me and she goes, you're that guy? They read all the books and they go to the lectures? I'm like, yep. So she says, listen, I want to hear all about your latest book. I said, no. I want to hear about your latest movie. She goes, you first. So I told her what I just told you in great detail. I said, I'm frustrated. She goes, don't worry. I'll call Prince Charles and Dame Judi Dench. I'll call Attenborough. I'll call, 2 days later, I get a phone call. Debbie called the Imperial War Museum, the Royal Archives. What can we do for you? And I wanted to say, right? But I didn't. I said, here's what I think happened. I don't know. Here's where it might be based on my work in archives. Here's blah, blah, blah. Now remember, a major archive like the Royal Archives in London, in England, or the National Archives in Washington. It's like that last scene in Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Remember when they took the Ark of the Covenant and it was sub-level 8, basement 16, row 3 million, right? I mean, there's 0.001% of what they have is on display. It's amazing to go underground and see these things. So 2 days later, I get the call and they said, Debbie called, what can we do? 2 days after that, so 4 days from meeting Debbie, they called and they said, we found it. Almost 800 pages of top secret documents, highly classified documents. They found it in Mar-a-Lago and Biden's home. So that's where they found it. I'm like, what the fuck? So hundreds of pages of top secret documents. And get this, they were in a box the size of this, and on the side of it, it said classified until the year 2045, making it a 100-year secret. So I'm like, oh my gosh. They said, what can we do for you? I'm like, I want them all. They go, you got it. I'm like, I'm on my way. So what was in the box was the Germans built a replica of the Titanic, thus the title of my book and the movie we did on it, The Nazi Titanic. And Goebbels and Hitler loved the ship. The only difference from the Titanic is that it had 3 funnels instead of 4 smokestacks. Opulent, 7-course dinners, grand ballroom, gold, Persian carpets, the whole 9 yards. At the very end of the war, they don't want the Allies to get their ship, and Hitler has committed suicide. So Heinrich Himmler orders the ship to the Lübeck Bay, L-U-B-E-C-K, in north central Germany, the town of Neustadt, N-E-U, New City, Neustadt. And there she sits. She's so big she can't dock. She has to lay anchor 3 kilometers out. And what they do is Heinrich Himmler orders that thousands of Holocaust survivors go on a death march. I estimate that at least 10,000 died on the death march. They take them to Neuengamme, KZ Neuengamme. It's a brick-making concentration camp with some medical experiments in Hamburg. Then from there, they march 60 kilometers to the coast. Then they load them up on the ship. And thousands die without food or water in the ship. And then they load thousands and thousands more. And the plan is to sail the ship to England, meet with Churchill or Truman or Montgomery or Eisenhower or somebody, and negotiate for a conditional surrender at the end of the war. We'll give you thousands and thousands of Holocaust survivors, Himmler's going to say, if you save my butt. Now, only unconditional surrender after that war. Right when Himmler's ready to board the ship, he gets caught. Hitler commits suicide. Eva Braun, his new wife, commits suicide. They kill their favorite dog, Blondie, the German Shepherd. Goebbels and his wife go to the bunker and kill their 6 children, wearing pajamas with teddy bears. Then they kill themselves. Himmler gets caught, commits suicide. Goring would get caught and commit suicide. So the ship's sitting there with thousands and thousands on it and people dying daily. The Nazis get 2 people in charge, Karl Kaufmann with a K and a K, and he's basically the mayor of the area, governor of the area, and a guy named Count George von Basewitz-Baer. He's the top Gestapo official there. And they say, we don't want all these people. So they said, let's load it up with everybody, fill it with fuel, and when we're forced to surrender, we'll blow it, killing thousands. The world will forget about the Titanic because many, many, many more will die on the ship. The Fuhrer's favorite ship will never be seized by the Allies, and the world will forget about the Titanic because of the Nazi Titanic. Right when they're ready to blow it, the British 6th Commando, General Mills Roberts, my second letter, race into the Baltic coast and wipe out the Nazis. Thousands of people on the ship, thousands at the port, trying to celebrate, skeletal, striped uniforms. And as the British are talking to everybody, the sky blackens above them. 6 squadrons, 8 planes per squadron, of Typhoon Mark 1B bombers fly in, and they all target the Nazi Titanic. And we, the Royal Air Force in England, and the Allies blow the ship out of the water, killing thousands instantly. Those that made it into the water, these Mark 1B Typhoon bombers, not unlike a British Lancaster or Halifax, if anybody loves their military history, or an American B-17, B-24, they have machine guns on the wings. So they strafe everybody in the water. Then they race down the port with thousands of people going like this, and they strafe everybody down the port. One of the pilots whose record was in the box that I was able to read, his name was Alan Weisse, W-Y-S-E. He wrote that I was sawing, S-A-W, torsos in half. The bullets that those things fired were the size of a tube of toothpaste, several per second. Someone on the port, just sawing bodies in half. Once they killed people at the port, the ship, in the water, everything, they flew back. We don't know the exact number, but maybe 25,000 people died instantly, at least 4,500 to 7,500 on the ship. The Allies were so appalled, they sealed the documents for 100 years. So there's more out there that we don't know. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm the opposite. But there's a lot out there, stories waiting to be told. And that's my sweet spot. These stories that are, untold. By dumb luck, again, I ran across another one. So let me do that. See if this is on. There we go. So this is the new book, Escape. Anybody saw the great film, The Great Escape? Right? World War II, great film. 73-ish Brits make it out of that Stalag Luft, the Nazi camp. Unfortunately, all but 3 get caught and get brutally killed. They dug a tunnel out. Decades and decades before, during the Civil War, 109 Union soldiers dig a bigger tunnel and escape, and it's way more successful. This is a much bigger and much more successful prison break, and it just disappeared from history. So first off, if you're like me, you love movies and books on prison escapes. People are morbidly fascinated by car wrecks. Doesn't everybody slow down and rubberneck, right? We're morbidly fascinated by shipwrecks, and we love prison break stories, right? We love them. Cool Hand Luke, Papillon, Escape from Alcatraz. Some of my favorites, The Count of Monte Cristo, right, everybody? Love it. And of course, Shawshank. So we love these stories, and Morgan Freeman was in that. Some of the most famous prison breaks in history, Father Gerard from the Tower of London hundreds of years ago. He, of course, throughout history, the Protestants and Catholics have always killed one another. There's your history in a nutshell. At the time, the Protestants were killing the Catholics in England. Father Gerard was a popular priest. He was popular, he was political, he was charismatic, so obviously the Crown arrested him and put him in the Tower of London. He's there for years. They light him on fire, they break his hands, they just torture him all the time. Finally, the guards come under his spell. He's so charismatic. He gets word out to his supporters. So they string a line from the tower across the river, and he escapes with broken hands, and he shimmies down. He tells the guards, if I escape, they're going to think you're complicit, so come with me. And they did. So he made it out. Napoleon escaped from Elba, right, everyone? So the little emperor running amok all across the European continent, he gets captured. Only Napoleon would do this. Instead of prison, he wants to go to a beautiful Mediterranean island. And they let him go. What does Napoleon do on the island? He makes himself emperor of the island, has everybody build roads, water treatment. He revolutionizes the island. He has them build ports, build ships. Once they do, he gets on a ship at the port and sails off. He returns to power for 100 days before his Waterloo. This is why all leaders are judged on their 100 days, their first 100 days. It's where it comes from, Napoleon. John Dillinger, this guy, one of the worst criminals in American history, just goes on crime and murder sprees. He gets caught, he's in prison in Indiana. He carves soap, it'll look like a pistol, shoe polish, and then he overpowers the guards, steals guns. Now, if you're America's Most Wanted and you escape, you're going to lay low. Dillinger can't help himself. He's a scorpion. He goes on a murder, killing, raping, theft spree and gets gunned down, Dillinger. Something sick about the American public. People love this guy. There were people rooting for him. I mean, he had love letters. He had, he was a hero. Al Capone was a hero to some. I don't understand that American tech. Stalag Luft, this is the one I told you, The Great Escape. And of course, everybody's been to Alcatraz, right? Where Morris and the Anglin brothers escaped. They made rafts after tunneling out of the jackets. They tunneled out and they were never found, which makes the story even better. Cold case from history. I'd like to think they made it to Boca. I don't know. Add it to the museum. I don't know, right? So our story in question deals with the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Textbooks say that 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War. The top Civil War scholars today in Gettysburg and the National Civil War Museum, everybody's agreed to move that number up to 700,000. New scholarship is all coming in on 700,000. This is a bloody long war. But one of the aspects of the Civil War we neglect, because it's so fantastical and important, pivotal in our history, the prisoners. Now, If the men died wholesale, the prisoners died like it was a charnel house. Why? Neither side was prepared for the war. The North said this will last a month. Lincoln said maybe 3 months. They had 30 and 90-day enlistments. Why was it going to end so quickly? Because the North had the advantage of what I call the 3 M's: more men, money, manufacturing. The South said it'll end in a month. Why? We like to fight and we have better generals. And they were right about both, I think. So both sides thought it would end early. The Civil War, of course, drags on and on and on, which meant neither side had set aside prisons, neither side had stockpiled food, clothing, blankets, medicine, or had doctors for all those prisons. So the prisons in the South were often nothing more than a stockade. Anybody been to Andersonville or Belle Isle? It's just like where you'd put horses or something. There's a stockade and the men were out in the exposed weather, just lying there dying wholesale. The South ran out of food, so if they couldn't feed their own citizens and soldiers, they're sure not going to feed the prisoners. Any prisoner that went into a Confederate camp was robbed, beaten, stripped, and then just thrown on the floor, thrown out into the open. A lot of Southerners died in northern prisons. Elmira, New York, known as Hellmira during the war. But they died because a disease went through. In the South, northern prisoners died from disease, but also starvation, neglect, torture, and mass murder. The Southerners acted in ways that are still unforgivable and just shocking. I'm happy to say most Northerners didn't treat the South like that. The South wholesale treated the North like that. So the prisons in the South were hellacious. Here's some vitals. So I put that 620, it's up to 700,000, which is 2% of the population. If you extrapolate that today, it's millions dying during the Civil War. We suffered over 51,000 casualties at Gettysburg. Anybody been to Gettysburg Battlefield? Love it there. Grew up right next to it. Was back there speaking the other day. 3 days in early July of 1863, Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia made it into Pennsylvania, the Keystone State. And after they defeated the Union there, they were going to march to Harrisburg, the capital, Philadelphia, the most important city, and then hit Washington, D.C., capture or kill Lincoln, and it's all over. Fortunately, they were stopped there. 70 to 80,000 Confederates meet 80 to 90,000 Union from the Army of the Potomac, and one of the largest clashes in the history of the continent. And thank God the Union prevailed. But over 51,000 casualties in just 3 days, to give you some sense. That's more people than died in the Korean War. That's more people that died in the Gulf War, War of 1812, Spanish-American War, Revolution War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Mexican-American wars put together by a big factor in that 3 days. More Americans died in prison camps during the Civil War than died in the Korean War. More Americans died in prison camps during the Civil War than all those early world wars put together by a factor of about 2. I mean, it's extraordinary at the rate at which they were dying, to the point where, if you think about it, if you were to take a time machine back to the 1860s, every family lost somebody in a prison camp. Every town lost a favorite son or someone in a prison camp. So some of these camps like Andersonville and the one we're going to talk about were infamous, notorious. There were songs about them. Soldiers sat around campfires saying, "Oh, I hope I don't go to the one we're going to talk about." It's like the boogeyman. So it was so hellacious. Three southern states, Alabama, North Carolina, and Virginia, each one lost over 30,000 men, each one. 4 northern states, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, each one lost over 30,000 men. Another 30,000 at least colored troops, black troops, and that's a part of history we don't spend enough time on either. So the losses were just shocking. More men died from disease than died from combat. The first war in history where we probably had more men die from combat than from disease was probably World War I. So throughout history, they just died from starvation and combat. And if that didn't kill you, the doctor killed you. Long before the AMA set standards, I read a couple of accounts at the prison and at Gettysburg and elsewhere where the surgeon / barber would have a table, and nurses who were not educated at nursing at FAU or someplace, they were just women volunteering. They would get men, put them on the table, give them a shot of whiskey, have them bite down on a leather strap, and then saw a leg off or an arm off. There were piles, they were described as 5 feet high, 5 feet wide piles of hands, feet, legs, and arms. And then the guy's passing out. The nurse has to take him off, set him down, keep him from going into shock, throw a bucket of water to wash the blood and gut off the table. Then the next guy who's watching is on the table. If you get shot through the arm and it breaks the bone or pierces an artery, you're going to die. So lose the arm to save the body. So what they did is they kept a fire beside it. They'd saw the arm off and then take a hot poker from the fire and stick it in the wound to cauterize it. And then next man up. And this is what surgeons did all day during the war. Just atrocious conditions. So the prisons, this is I've written on the Holocaust, I lecture on the Holocaust, so I say this, please know, with all due respect. But a lot of the descriptions, a lot of the photos, a lot of the letters reminded me of the stuff I read during the Holocaust. Men reduced at 70, 80 pounds, hadn't eaten in days, too weak to get up, skin and bones. This is a prisoner at Andersonville, a Union prisoner at Andersonville, to give you a sense of what the Confederacy was doing to the prisons. So over 400,000 prisoners imprisoned, 56,000 at least were killed in prisons. It's probably a lot higher because the South did not keep accurate records. The North's records are somewhat reliable. So the North lost more men than the South, even though more Southerners were put into prison because the Southerners mistreated the Northerners. The Northerners didn't just abuse and mass murder the Southerners. This is a picture of Andersonville at the top. Overcrowding. Get this, in 14 months at the end of the war in Andersonville, which is in southern Georgia, in 14 months, 13,000 Union soldiers died there. 13,000 in 14 months. I was just there, I gave a speech to the Andersonville, and then I went there for National POW Day to lead a program. And there were a lot of folks from the area there, and they all started yelling at me. You want to know what they were mad about? Why aren't we flying the Confederate flag? I said, because it's the U.S. National Park Service, and there's 13,000 graves of Union soldiers that are dead. We shouldn't fly the Confederate flag over it. And they were angry about that. So goodness gracious, we're still fighting this nonsense. This is a replica to give you a sense of what it looked like back then. See this little wooden contraption along the wall? It was called the dead zone. The guards and all these crow's nests, they called them. If you crossed that, they just killed you on the spot. So people were just lying out there in masses. Here's the prison I want to talk about, Libby. It was known as the Bastille of the Confederacy, the Castle of Despair, but the prisoners called it Rat Hell. Why? They described that they're lying half naked, no shoes, and 24 hours a day, rats just swarmed over them in great numbers, to the point where they just gave up trying to shoo them away or defend themselves. So it was called Rat Hell. The real name of it was Confederate Prison Number 1, but it was known as Libby. Why? Do you see the white sign in the middle of the building? That sign said Libby and Sons. There was a guy from Maine named Luther and Libby and his son George, and they bought this and turned it into a chandlery. Has anybody heard of a chandler or a chandlery? This is like a warehouser for ships, right? They provide sails, tar, fruit, nails, whatever ships need. So this was in Richmond, and over there you can see that's the James River, an historic river that runs from there 60 kilometers or so to Williamsburg, southeast. So ships would pull up, and then this was filled with tobacco, cotton, as well as sails, tar, and whatever they needed. So that was the place. You can see bars on the window. This is where the soldiers stayed. Why did the soldiers stay out, the prison guards? Why did they stay outside? Because the inside smelled like death. When you went in, you threw up. That was the condition inside of it. In the basement, the dungeon, it's where the sewage system went. So it was filled with feces and urine and thousands of rats. So it was just an atrocious place. Libby was built by John Enders, who wanted to build a couple of warehouses for tobacco on Tobacco Row in Richmond, which became the capital of the Confederacy. The first capital was Montgomery, Alabama, but Montgomery's in the middle of nowhere, and back then no roads, rivers, railway, whereas Richmond is intersected by several roads, several railways, and the James. So it made more sense to move the capital from Montgomery in the hinterlands to Richmond. At any rate, so John Enders builds the place, and it looks kind of haunted in this picture, and I picked that picture for a reason. When Enders is finishing the construction. He's up on the roof, the ladder breaks, the roof breaks, and he falls to his death. It then goes to his oldest daughter's husband, who dies suddenly and mysteriously. So it goes to the oldest daughter, who dies suddenly and mysteriously. All this crazy stuff is happening to the point where no one would rent it, and it became known as, like, today there would be the spot for the ghost tours, right? You know, so it was haunted. It was said to be haunted. Nobody wanted to touch it. Therefore, it just sat empty, and then they sold it to that guy from Maine named Libby, who didn't know about its reputation, and he bought it. Libby. Now, when the war breaks out, they arrest Libby's son and throw Libby out and just confiscate it. So he lost everything in that. This is an actual room in the prison. Each one's about 3 times the size of this room, and you would put up to 1,000 men in there. It was so overcrowded. No barracks, no toilets, no nothing. They just slept on the floor. The windows were open with the bars, so in the summer the heat came in, the bugs came in. In the winter, the snow or the rain or the freezing air came in. In the winter, they would, in the morning when they got up, they'd always count how many men at the end of the floor by the window were frozen stiff and dead of hypothermia or something, frozen stiff. The men had to pile on top of one another, so the only way they could sleep was they would organize by units, and like newlyweds, they would all spoon. So they would get, 100 men in a row, and they'd all spoon. And then every hour, the guards would say 2 o'clock and all's well, 3 o'clock and all's well. And when they said that, the commanding officer, the most ranking officer, would say, okay, spoon left, 1, 2, 3. And they'd roll over on their left. And they were just wedged. They kept warm. And by flipping every hour, their body didn't turn into just welts, because they were down to 70 pounds or something, many of them naked or half naked. So they just lined up, spoon to keep warm and to get a place to lie down. Libby was the central receiving area for all southern prisons. And one of the contributions, I think, of this book that was shocking and appalling to me, one of the things I think people liked about it, historians I should say, was it was one of the earliest horrific examples of American propaganda. It was used for propaganda and disinformation. So if you're a prisoner anywhere in the battle, anywhere in the theater of war, you would be taken by wagon, by foot, or by train to Richmond. And at the train station, then you had to walk the main street, and Libby's at the end of the street. And you had to walk the gauntlet. When you get to the end, there's the haunted house you've been hearing about. And they would see the faces of skeletons with hollowed eyes looking out at them. And the warden would say, there. That's your future, that's you. And they had to walk the gauntlet. What the Southerners would do is they'd all line the street, and as the men walked by, they'd throw garbage and feces on them, and they'd walk up and sucker punch them, get wood and hit them over the head. Some prisoners described old ladies screaming at the guards, give me your gun so I can kill them all. Southern belles, my ass. So this is what they had to deal with walking down the street. Just brutal. So that it terrorized the men. Then you get into Libby, and they beat you, strip you, and rob you. And then you're put in one of these floors where you wait to die. The other thing that was unique about Libby was its location. Tobacco Row in Richmond. It's right around the corner from where Jefferson Davis had his Confederate White House. It's the capital of the Confederacy. So they used Libby for generals, colonels. They even captured a member of Congress and put him there. So high-ranking people. So Libby was in the news because it's where the famous generals and colonels all went. So there you go. And of course, in the Holocaust, you have these disgusting signs that over camps, work will set you free, right, everybody? At Libby, they had a line from Dante's Inferno, all hope abandoned, ye who enter here, welcome to hell. It's the gates of hell. So, they put all the dressing on all this. These are the 2 wardens. This is the head warden, Tom Turner, who was a little guy. This is the assistant warden, Dick Turner, no relation, who was a big bear of a man. And the prisoners were obviously afraid of this guy because he was big and he would just beat people all the time. But the one they were really afraid of was this guy. This guy lacked, and there's some quotes about him, lacked any sense of humanity or empathy. He loved to walk through the prison with his guards, and he would say, the men are just lying, dying, stab that man. And he'd go up to someone and kick his head in and say, stab that one. And then someone would look at him, he goes, put him in the dungeon in solitary. He was just brutal. He was absolutely sick, Turner. The prisoners one of the pastimes was hoping that they could get alone with him for 5 minutes. because he was such a monstrous human being. That's Dick Turner, the assistant warden. He's in the dungeon. This is the area where the sewer went through and filled with rats, and he would put people in there in the dungeon. Remember this photo. There's an interesting ending to this story. Also remember the dungeon. So that's how the prisoners escape. They go into the dungeon, into the feces, into the sewer with the rats, because no one would think of looking there. So that's where they went to escape, through raw sewage. So there is the prison. After a couple men tried to escape and were killed, they painted the bottom of it white. So if you're sneaking along it at night, your shadow, you'd be silhouetted. So there it is. Anyways, the men, remember, these are generals, colonels. There's famous actors. There's playwrights from Broadway. There's university professors, university presidents. There's lawyers and judges. This is an amazing prison, not unlike, if anybody knows anything about the Holocaust, Terezin or Theresienstadt by Prague, where there were thousands of Jewish intellectuals, musicians, artists, and poets, and so forth. So it's really an impressive group. So they published a newspaper. They called it the Libby Chronicle. Now, they often didn't have paper, so they would just whisper articles to one another. If they were too loud, Turner would come up and kill them. So they published the paper. The other way they stayed alive is there were so many Broadway type of actors and singers that they put on plays and musicals in the prison from memory. From memory. At Theresienstadt, a Schachter, the famous Jewish composer, was made by the Nazis to put on Verdi's Requiem by memory, and he did, to give you the talent in some of these places. So they put on plays, and they also had classes. They had soldiers from Cuba, from all across Europe, who were there in the prison. Why? They heard about slavery, and they wanted to fight for the principles of freedom. One of the guys you'll meet in a moment was from Cuba. His name was Cavada. And Cavada saw the southern treatment of slavery as similar to the way Spain mistreated Cuba. So he goes to Philadelphia, then goes to fight in the war to try to fight to end slavery. So ideals. They also pranked the guards. Their favorite prank was when the guards made them do roll call all the time. So hundreds and thousands of prisoners would line up, and they would count heads, so people would duck down and pop up again over here. Or if someone had a hat, they'd put the hat on their hand. Then the guards would start counting. And the prisoners would all make an agreement. When they get to 436, everybody yell. 435, 436, and all the prisoners would yell, 352, 478, 569, and the guards would forget where they were and then have to start over again. That meant you had to stand longer, and you were often beaten, but you know what? It was worth it. It was worth it to do that. So they said their favorite pastime inside, their favorite form of exercise was scratching from all the lice and vermin that covered them. So Socrates' student was Plato, who creates the academy, right? The first university in the West. Plato's student was Aristotle, who creates the Lyceum, like a university. So they created the Lyceum. And then they would all line up and see who would scratch the most because they were just infested. There was no water to bathe or clean, no toiletry, no nothing inside the prison. This guy is Nathan Bedford Forrest. He's known for two things. One, that's where Forrest Gump got his name. Remember Mama Gump? Said, Forrest, you're named after a great general. And he was proud of it. Nathan Bedford Forrest was maybe the worst American ever to live. He was the founder of the KKK. He was also infamous for this. It's the Fort Pillow massacre in Tennessee. He would not allow prisoners or anybody to surrender. He would kill everybody on the battlefield. And then he would kill women, children, and people in town. He just killed everyone. He also said when Lincoln put black soldiers in uniform, now he's just going to kill every Northerner, irrespective. So, and he was not the only Southerner to do that. So a monstrous human being. The point being, they refused to do prisoner exchanges. So by the winter of 1863 to 64, 64 would be the last full year of the war, prisoner exchanges stopped. So if you're in Libby, you're either going to die or you have to escape, and you'll probably die. By winter of 63, they ran out of food, medicine, so they were eating once every 3 days, and they were already skeletal. They wrote down what they ate. I added up the caloric intake based on the ounces. They were not getting enough calories to stay alive. So if you ate, you died slowly. They weren't given enough water to stay alive, so if you drank, you died slowly. And if you didn't, you died quickly. So by December 63, January 64, they were all going to die. They had one choice. They had to escape. So that's when the idea came from that. Here's the way they escaped. Through this tunnel, through this fireplace to the tunnel, are two heroes in it. Colonel Thomas E. Rose from near Philadelphia. Rose grew up in Quaker country, and the Quakers, as you know, are abolitionists, advocates for an education, women's rights. Rose was very progressive. Rose became a school teacher and then moved to Pittsburgh and became a principal. Rose was very quiet and shy, but he was a mountain of a man with a big beard, but very shy despite his enormous physique. Rose was disgusted with the South and slavery, so when the war started, he enlisted right away as a private. In no time at all, Rose was at a colonel. Why? He's not a speaker, he's quiet, he leads by example. If his unit was on a mission, he would be out front. If the Union line was breaking, Rose pulled his sword and pistol and ran, was the one that plugged the hole. He was always the first one charging. So the men were so inspired by this mountain of a man who fought. So Rose is the one responsible for this. What Rose does is he meets Major Andrew G. Hamilton, who's from Kentucky. Now, the area where he's from in Kentucky is pro-South. But what happened is the Confederates went through that town and just raped and stole and killed their own people. So Hamilton says, I'm joining and I'm going on behalf of the Union. Hamilton is MacGyver. He comes up with so many things. Rose is the leader, Hamilton's the MacGyver. So here's what happens. Rose one day realizes they're going to die. The roof was leaking and it was so cold, a storm came out, massive storm, lightning. So the Confederate guards ran, leaving the scaffolding up. So Rose goes over to the window, thinking the bars are in the window, but he's so big and strong. If I can bust the bars, I could jump onto the scaffolding, work my way down and escape. And he's there at the scaffolding, and he's working on the bars, and a lightning strikes, and it illuminates his face, and there's a face beside his. They both gasp. It's Hamilton. They both had the exact same idea at the exact same time. They nod and quietly go back to their bunks. The next day, Rose says, I got to try something else. He sees the rats streaming in and out of the dungeon and going to the river. So he knows there's a sewer. If he can get into the dungeon, dig into the sewer, he can swim through the sewage and then it drop into the river. So he goes to the dungeon and there's a big double door with a deadbolt. Rose is so big, he busts the door down. And he's walking in a dungeon barefoot. Every step he steps on rats and a half a foot of feces. And he's working along the wall trying to find the entrance. And as he's walking along the wall, he bumps into someone. They both grab one another. It's Hamilton. 2 nights in a row. So they shake hands and say, let's work together. Hamilton was, bromance, loved Rose. Rose was legendary in that at the Battle of Chickamauga, which is in Georgia, Tennessee area, Rose is leading his army to a counterattack and he gets wounded and is captured. They're taking him by train to Richmond. It's stormy, dark night. Rose jumps off the train, misjudges the landing and breaks his foot and ankle. On a broken foot and ankle, he runs for hours until he's finally captured again. They beat him over the head with the guns, probably damaged, and knock him out, put him on the train. When he arrives in Richmond, now all the men are huddled together. Now they have to walk what? The gauntlet. And they're all huddled together as people are hitting them and throwing feces on them, except Rose. Rose is out front just walking like a robot kind of thing. Rose is just walking. People would come up and spit on his face and he didn't wipe it off. They'd come up and throw feces on him, he didn't blink. People would come up and hit him over the head with wood and he would keep walking. The men thought he had lost it. What he was doing was he was counting the number of steps. He was memorizing every street, where there were lanterns, where there were guards, where there were not. He put a map of the city in his head. That's why he wasn't worried about anything. He gets to Libby and they beat him again, knocking him out again over the head with guns, strip him, rob him, and throw him in one of the rooms. So Rose was notorious for his strength and was a hero. So what they do is they try to get into the dungeon. Now they can't. The next night they go down, the Confederates put a triple deadbolt on the door and had a guard. So Hamilton says there's a fireplace in the mess where they cook. The problem, the good news is they don't use the fireplace. The bad news, there's 3 giant black cauldrons where they cook the soup. And if you have to move those, so Rose says, Rose is so big he can move the cauldrons. And then Hamilton steals a knife from a guard and has to file the mortar out and removes it brick by brick every night, and they dig a hole and drop down in the dungeon. Before it's sunrise, they have to climb back up, replace it brick by brick, put the mortar back, and Rose has to put the cauldrons back and then run upstairs. So they spend every night digging their tunnel. The problem is that means they're not sleeping. They're already dying. Rose says it's not if, it's when. We only got a little while. So they have to dig furiously or they're going to die. But if they don't escape, they're going to die. So they're going to die or they're going to die. There's your motivation to dig out. This is the actual tunnel from the prison. There's a couple other people that help them besides Rose and Hamilton. Colonel Abel Strait. He's a raider. He takes horses and donkeys and goes through the South raiding supplies. The South catching, they're so angry at him for being a raider that what they do is they lock him in the dungeon. So Strait lives in the dungeon in feces and darkness with the rats. So what Rose and Hamilton do is each night when they go down, they save a little bit of their hardtack, which is basically a bread the consistency of the heel of my shoe. You usually put it in water so you don't lose teeth. They save a little hardtack, a little water, a little mush. They called it burgoo. It was like oatmeal with worms in it. And they would save it. They're dying. They saved a little to take it down for the colonel. So the three of them are living on food that doesn't keep two people alive. And so they have to take him into their confidence because he's stuck in the dungeon every night. The other one is Bartleson. Frederick Bartleson was a hero, a colonel from Illinois who lost an arm during the war. And after his, the surgery, his amputation, he goes back into uniform and is fighting with one arm. He's in the prison. He can't help them dig out because of his condition, but he's a poet. So what he does is whenever there's an exchange, the Union soldiers are allowed to write letters to their moms, their girlfriends, their daughters. Bartleson writes poems for everybody. So he's the poet, and he reads the poems at night to keep these men alive. And the last one's Cavada, the Cuban. He's a dashing, like cavalier-looking guy from Cuba who's fighting for principle. He's an engineer, he's multilingual, he's a professor, he's a scientist, he's a Renaissance man. Cavada is one of the ones that comes up with the hot air balloon brigades. They float a hot air balloon above the battlefield. He uses semaphore flags to tell them where the Confederates are. And then they land a balloon, he quick sketches the battlefield, and the rider runs it to the officers. At Gettysburg, he lands in his balloon, and the Confederates were waiting for him, and they capture him. He's this person who's ruining the Confederacy through the balloons. He's from Cuba, so the Confederates beat him almost every day. Cavada is too weak to escape because being Latino, he was just beaten. An immigrant, right? Foreigner. Some things never change. So Cavada, he can't possibly escape with them, but he's a brain. He helps them come up with ideas. He helps them to tells Rose how to dig the tunnel so it doesn't collapse. So Cavada does that. Now, this is obviously not their tunnel. No picture of the tunnel survives, but I found a dozen diaries and detailed descriptions. I spent months looking at every picture of an underground tunnel I could until I found one that looked like what they described. This is as close as it would be. As you can see, there's no room to turn around, just barely enough room to do it. Rose was so big, he was always scraped up and bleeding on both sides. He was so big, he would get stuck in the tunnel. The only way to get out is he had to back up the whole way. When he gets so far down into the tunnel, there's not enough air, he would pass out. So Major Hamilton, MacGyver, steals candles to keep candles lit so he can see. The candles go out, so Hamilton steals a straw hat, puts wood in it, sews it up so it's rigid, and he stands at the entrance and fans air in. When Rose would pass out, Hamilton steals clothing lines of the guards, ties it around Rose's ankle, and he can pull Rose out when he passes out. Now, the problem is when you dig rock and dirt, you get a little dirt and rock, you got to back the whole way out. It takes forever, and then they have to hide it. So Hamilton steals a spittoon and a knapsack, creates a pulley system. Rose yanks on his foot, Hamilton pulls it out, empties it, Rose yanks it back in. So it's very efficient. Hamilton comes up with everything. He's a home builder, by the way, before the war. So now what to do with all this dirt? There's a giant pile of straw which was used for the bedding for the guards. The only reason for the pile of straw now is that's where the thousands of rats live. So Hamilton would put the dirt under the straw, and no one would look in the straw because of all the rats. So a couple things happen. The very first tunnel Rose digs, he gets into the sewer, he underestimates it's filled, the sewer caves in on him, and he almost drowns in raw sewage. Now he can't get a bath, he has no towel, he has to stay in a dungeon for days until the feces is off him so he doesn't go upstairs and smell like it, or they would know something's up. So he lives in the dungeon along with the other folks who were stuck there. There was a poor guy named Captain Johnston who helped them dig the tunnels. One day he was down digging with a couple other men and the guards come in. They all run and hide. Johnston is out in the open. He dives into the pile of straw. Rats all over him. And when you dive into straw, he feels a sneeze coming. And there's guards walking around with lanterns. Then the guard walks in with a bloodhound. And Johnston's in there trying to hold his nose from a sneeze. The bloodhound goes right to the straw. And as Johnston's ready to sneeze his head off, and the guards are ready to jam their bayonets into it, a couple rats run out. The bloodhound chases the rats, and the guards say, "Damn rats." And they left because it was so nasty. The problem is, he was down there. He has to live in the dungeon until they escape. So now Rose and Hamilton have to bring the little bit of food and water for 4 men down under. So they're dying more and more. They had the lottery of death. What the commandant would do is he would say, "Today, he'd call out 6 colonels. Come up here. Pick a straw. Whichever one gets the short straw, bang." Just psychological terror on these soldiers. I'm going to skip the rest for the name. This is one of my girls. This is Crazy Bet, Elizabeth Van Lew. So what the South knew is there was a high-placed Union spy in Richmond. And they spent the entirety of the war trying to find out who it was. It was an older woman. They never found out until the war was over. Elizabeth Van Lew was the wealthiest person in Richmond. There she is at her mansion. Here she is. They were from Philadelphia, Quakers. She was an abolitionist. She used her fortune to buy slaves, free them, and they lived in the house with her because she gave them protection. What she did is, they said she was crazy because 1, she never married. 2, she was a feminist. 3, she was against slavery. And 4, she acted crazy. So in the genteel South, no one would expect a crazy old woman, right? So crazy like a fox. So what she did is, she had so much money, she would bake food, and she would take the food down to Libby Prison. And of course, the guards are starving. She would tell the guards, "I will give you all these cakes and all that if you let me give some to the soldiers." So they did. She kept the soldiers alive by feeding them. But when she would give them eggs, she would hollow out one and put a note in there, where to escape, when to escape, and how to get to her house. She also passed information through a codex. Grant and General Benjamin Butler taught her how to use a codex. She wrote in yellow lemon juice. When heated up with milk, it becomes visible. I showed my kids how to do it. They finally thought my job was cool. And then I showed them Indiana Jones for the next 3 years. Anyway, so Crazy Bet saves countless men. She risks her life daily. She's remarkable. Here's the actual room where she hid the soldiers, and this is an artist imagined image of her saving the soldiers. I'm happy to tell you, Crazy Bet lives through the war. After the war, the South found out it was her. So they marched to her house with torches. They're going to burn it down with her and all the former slaves in it. She goes out on the porch and screams at everybody, "You know Grant loves me. If you burn this house down, Grant's on his way." Remember, the South was scared of Grant. She talks them down out of it, but they rob her of everything she had. Fortunately, the men who escaped sent her money, including Paul Revere's grandson. And when Grant becomes president, he makes her a postmaster general. So she has a job. So Crazy Bet. Okay, the tunnel, I'll skip that. It took 38 days. Here's Richmond. This is Williamsburg, the Potomac, the Chesapeake, and the access to the Atlantic. It's a 60-mile-ish trip down there. So Crazy Bet tells them where to go. The Union took Williamsburg. So these men got to go 60 miles. Remember, Rose still has a broken foot and ankle. At night, Rose makes the men walk circles around the camp, stepping over one another, because he wants them to be in shape. Yeah, he figures everything out. So it's time to break out. February 9th, 1864, they break out. Now, the way they do it, Isaac Johnston digs, and he comes up, and dirt falls in his eyes, and he feels the cold rush of a bitterly cold night. So he runs back, he crawls back through the tunnel and tells Rose, who goes racing back into the tunnel. Rose pops his head up, and there's a Confederate boot beside him. They came up on this side of the gate, next to the sentry. Rose goes down, the guard says, "Hey," and starts stabbing. He's cutting Rose's face with his bayonet, but doesn't go through him. Rose can't make a move or make a sound. Rose, after the guard stops, patches up the hole, but it took off a shoe, He had one shoe and put it above, then patched up the hole. The next day, he peeks out the window and sees he's a couple feet shy. He figures out the math and trajectory. The next night, they dig out, it's time to escape. So they announce it's time to escape. They go in twos. The men vote to allow Rose and Hamilton to go first. They're the first two out. 109 men escape. They go on the run. Rose had told every man about the map, made everybody memorize the map of Richmond. Rose and Hamilton are running, Rose on a broken ankle. They turn around a corner at night and there's a bunch of Confederate guards. Rose tells Hamilton to run and walks up to the guards to talk to them as if he's a civilian, risking his life. He talks his way out of it. Here's why he's lucky. All the soldiers were robbed. The Confederacy ran out of clothing and couldn't make good clothing. They all wanted blue Union jackets and pants. Everybody in Richmond was wearing Union blue. So Rose kind of blended in, talked his way out of it. Rose runs for a week. Hamilton's the first one to make it to Williamsburg, and he tells them they're coming. So Union soldiers are fanning out looking for them. Rose runs for a week. At one point, he has to hide in a log. At one point, he gets a reed, and he's under the water breathing through it because the Confederates are around the pond. I mean, it's a movie, everybody. At least I hope. I still have tuition. My daughter's talking about getting a PhD. I'm like, oh. Dad's proud of you, but at any rate, so Rose, after a week on a broken ankle, makes it to the outskirts of Williamsburg. Now, there's a wide field like a football field, and there he can see the fires, smell the bacon, hear the soldiers, but he lies down in the woods, even though he's dying and starving, just to make sure there's no Confederates. The Confederates know the Union has Williamsburg, so surely there's Confederate guards in the area. So he watches for hours. Satisfied he doesn't see anyone, he runs. Gets halfway across the field, 5 Confederate guards stand up out of the grass. They get into a fight. Rose takes the gun from one and busts one guy. Rose is beating the 5 of them until one hits him over the head. Third time, he's knocked out with a blow over the head. They take him back to Libby and lock him in solitary. After all that, several men made it. Several were captured. 2 drowned trying to cross the James. They were so weak that they just drowned. They underestimated it. Rose is taken back to the prison. I'm going to skip that for time. When the war ends in April of '65, Lincoln wants to visit Richmond. Unfortunately, the Confederates said, if we can't have Richmond, no one can. They burn their own capital to the ground. And all the people from Richmond have fled. They could have gone back to housing, but now they have nothing. Lincoln goes to Richmond to meet with Jeff Davis and the Confederates. They all ran. He also goes to Richmond. He wants to see Libby. So Lincoln and Tad walk through the streets. He goes to see Libby, and a crowd gathers and yells, "We will tear it down, we will tear it down." Lincoln says, no, leave it as a monument to what people will do to one another during times of war. What brother will do to brother. It must stand, leave it. And of course, days later, Lincoln's assassinated. Here's the guys I told you about. There's Rose. There's the big hero. Rose is taken back to solitary confinement. We don't know how, and all the soldiers don't know how. He lived to the end of the war on barely eating and stuck in solitary. The guy just wouldn't die. He re-enlists, gets the rank of general, and spends the rest of his career in uniform. He's a great hero. Late in life, the soldiers that survived begged him to write an account about it. Rose was so humble. No, I wasn't a hero, I was lucky. They begged him. Finally, Rose agrees and writes a couple pages saying we were lucky and we got out. The prisoners were so angry that it prompted Hamilton and all the rest to write their accounts. So I had about a dozen firsthand accounts, including some that made it out and some that were stuck back in Richmond, so I had both sides. This is Hamilton, the dashing young major. Hamilton, the first out. He's the one who helps the Union find all the guys. Hamilton goes back to Kentucky. The problem is Kentucky turns very Southern in character, and Hamilton is not a hero. He's a scoundrel because he worked for the Union. So this great hero and veteran, Hamilton and one other veteran decide on a Saturday night after the war to go to a local saloon. And it's a nice night, so they're sitting outside for a drink. Some good old boys come up and see him, so they shoot and kill Hamilton right after the war ends. This is Cavada, the Cuban, the engineer, the scientist, the intellectual. He lives through Libby somehow. After the war, he goes back to Cuba, where he becomes a general. He is now seen as a Jose Marti figure in Cuba. I led a tour to Cuba a few years ago. There was Cavada Street, Cavada Square, Cavada Hospital. He's the leader of the resistance against the Spanish government. What he does is he's friends with Grant and everyone. So he funnels letters to them. He's going to get on a boat at night and go to Philadelphia. His old comrades have a stockpile of money, weaponry, and food for him. He's going to bring it back for the revolution. Somebody rats him out, and the Spanish capture him. Grant intervenes, begging the Spanish. They torture him until they kill him. Cavada. This is Strait, the colonel that was stuck in solitary, the raider they hated. He's a big guy. Strait is escaping. He gets stuck in the tunnel like Winnie the Pooh. They have to strip him down. They're pushing from behind and pulling him from the front. They finally get him out of the tunnel. He's so weak, they contact Crazy Bet. She runs down and gets him, covers him in a blanket, and she hides him in her house for weeks until the search ends, and Crazy Bet helps him to get back. This is the one-armed Bartleson, the poet that inspired everybody. And when everybody left, they gave Bartleson all their love letters, their memories, so that if he lives, he could take everything out. Bartleson lives through it, but instead of publishing everything, he re-enlists. And in the final days of the war, he's shot and killed, leading a unit from the front. In closing, here's a line from one of Bartleson's poems. Remember, the guards would yell 3 o'clock and all is well. Ah, is it so, my fellow captive sleeping, where the barred window's strictest watch is keeping, dreaming of home and wife and prattling child, of the sequestered vale, the mountain wild. Tell me, when cruel morn shall break again, wilt thou repeat the sentinel's refrain, all is well. So he wrote poems to inspire the men, to keep them alive. What happened to Libby? They tore it down, despite what Lincoln said. They took it brick by brick to Chicago, and they built a museum out of Libby. It became the Great Libby Civil War Museum. For a couple of years, it was like a Disney thing. Everybody went there, and they would reenact the escape and all that, kind of cheesy. But then fanfare died out, and it went out of business, and they told everybody there, just take everything. The cannons, the bricks, where's Libby today? It's a brick in a barn in Indiana. It's a brick in a farm in Nebraska. We don't know. It's spread out. There is no Libby anymore. This is what was inside, and all that's gone, unfortunately, tragically. So if you go to Richmond today, as I have, this is my picture. You go to Richmond today on 20th and Carey Streets. There's an empty parking lot next to a big brick museum. And that's where Libby used to be. And there's no signs of it anymore except like what driver's license. A license plate. So there's a seawall because of the flooding, and right next to it on the right is a hole, and that's where joggers and people walking their dogs go, and all the dogs pee on the wall where the Libby sign is. So I asked, every time I go, I stand there for an hour or two just as an experiment, asking, and has anybody ever heard of Libby? Nope. Anybody ever looked at this sign? Nope. Now here's your poetry. This is hallowed ground, right? Consecrated ground, the bones of thousands of Union soldiers. Guess what the museum is they built on top of Libby, and they had no idea? The Virginia Holocaust Museum. I went in, if anybody knows Jay and Marilyn Weinberg, they helped build it, now they live in Boca. I went into the museum and met with everybody and said, you know what's underneath this? Nobody had an idea. And so it's on the ground. So what an appropriate poetic way that maybe we honor that consecrated ground today. This is 4 feet high, barred windows, and the key to Libby, it's in the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I went there a couple times to work with them on their exhibit. They had a couple things wrong, but we didn't know it was guesswork. Now we dug up the papers and we were able to correct the historical record. Outside of it, there's a picture of Lincoln and Tad and a line from his second inaugural, right before he was killed, and when they went to visit the area, Abe and Taddy. There's 2 famous paintings of Libby. Here's one of them. It's a beautiful painting, but it's completely inaccurate. Number 1, there's not many soldiers. Number 2, they're all dressed. Number 3, they're well fed. Number 4, they're reading and hanging out and playing. So they're having a good time. So it's completely inaccurate. Put 10 times as many men in. Half of them are naked, half are barely dressed. They're skeletons and are lying on the floor dying. That's Libby. This one I like a little more. It's still not accurate, but doesn't it have that Dante's Inferno? It looks like purgatory or something. I like the dark, ominous. There's a couple soldiers dying, but they still should be skinnier, weaker, and way, way, way. These guys are muscular. They should be down to skin and bones. So the misinformation from history. And there's really only those 2 pictures at all. And there's a shameless plug for the book. With that, I'm happy to take questions. Anything you'd like to talk about? Yes, ma'am.
What happened to the 2 commanders who treated them?
What happened to the two commanders? Remember the picture of Dick Warner, the big guy standing at the dungeon? They caught him and they put him in that dungeon. Good. That's right. Good, good. I'd like to be a better person and not wish for that, but I enjoyed when I found it out. Tom Turner, the brutal little commander, he escaped. He fled. He hooks up in Texas with General Jubal Early, if anybody remembers him, one of Lee's favorite generals. And they say, we will never live in the United States under Union persecution. So they flee to Mexico, and they hate Mexico. So they flee to Cuba, and they hate Cuba. So they flee to England, and they hate England. They flee to Canada, and they hate Canada. And then the next president, the 17th president, Johnson, he pardons them, and they come back to Virginia. So he changes his name, and as best as we can tell, he lived a long, comfortable life after all the monstrous things that he had done. Yeah. So sometimes justice is not done.
Are you finished with the World War II book that you told us about at the beginning?
Yeah, the Nazi Titanic book is out. It was released a couple years ago. They made a Science and Discovery Channel made an hour show about it. It's out. It's in paperback, Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble. So anyway, yeah. So it's a crazy story. I still can't get my brain around it. Sir.
Yes, Dr. Watson, after you write your books, you probably get cards and letters of people making comments and things like that. Is there one that particularly stands out to you, a letter that you may have received after one of your books?
Yeah, Christopher Hawkins. So I got a lot of letters from people who said my great-great-grandfather was in Libby, and made it through, and they had maybe a paper, so they got the book. I sent them some notes. I called them on the phone. The Nazi Titanic, I got a call one day, and as a young man, he was a writer for The Atlantic in New York. He called me on the phone. He was hyperventilating on the phone. He goes, oh my God. He goes, are you sitting down? Yeah. My grandfather was on the Nazi Titanic. He's in your book on page like 235. I go, oh my God. He goes, you ready for this? He's alive. So I called Deborah Oppenheimer, that Academy Award winner that got me we grabbed cameras and we flew to Buffalo and found him there, and we taped a Shoah, an oral history interview with him. And I told him, I said, listen, this is going to sound insensitive, but I have to ask, why didn't you ever tell the story? I mean, one knows why, but you have to ask for history. And he said, I didn't tell the story. He said, then my grandson, who's now the older, he's a writer for The Atlantic. My grandson, like in high school, they had a day where they bring family members in and talk about the family. And he said, Grandpa, you got to come in and talk about it. So he said, I mustered up the courage to go in and talk about. He said, I walked in, he said, I was on this replica of the Titanic. It was the worst disaster. And the teacher said, thank you, you can sit down now, sir. The teacher didn't believe him. After decades, he got the cut. So he said, I never spoke of it again, except to my grandson. But he happily told us the story. He passed away about 2-3 years ago. I also had one guy that escaped named Francis Akos, A-K-O-S. He was a violinist for the Budapest Jewish Symphony, survived Auschwitz, death marches on the ship. The ship's 3 kilometers out. Akos, get this, swims 3 kilometers. The Baltic's 42 degrees Fahrenheit. He just survived death camp. Michael Phelps could not swim 3 kilometers in those conditions. He gets to the shore. He's trying to climb out. These Hitler Youth come out of the woods and start killing everybody on the shore. He goes back in and treads water. He finally comes back, and he's walking naked toward the town of Neustadt, and he hears a voice behind him, hands up, criminals. He turns around, and there's a little Hitler Youth kid holding a gun. He hears a machine gun. The kid crumbles. It's General Mills Roberts, the 2nd letter, and the 6th Commando. They rescue Francis Akos. He moves to Chicago, becomes the first chair violinist for the Chicago Philharmonic, retires as the concert master. I interviewed him late in life. It was tough because he had dementia, but his daughter, Katie, who was the concert master of the San Francisco Orchestra, helped me do the interview. So when Katie called me and said my grandpa is in a retirement home, he's got dementia, but my favorite was Christopher Hawkins. I wrote a book about the Revolutionary War and a brutal campaign where almost everybody died. There was a little 13-year-old boy named Christopher Hawkins from Providence, Rhode Island, who survived. And this little boy runs for days, starving, makes it back home, re-enlists. I mean, it's an incredible story. I really, really fell for Christopher Hawkins in his story. I was rooting for him. Historians are supposed to be objective and neutral. I champion someone who's trying to. Christopher Hawkins lived through it, so he's one of the heroes of my story. I spent years trying to find archives on this topic, and I knew that he and a lot of the other kids from this battle lived in Providence, Rhode Island. So I sent to the Providence, Rhode Island Library a box of dark chocolate McNuts, because you can get anybody to do anything for dark chocolate McNuts. So yeah, okay, so I'll send them next time I need to film another TV show here. So what happened is I told them about this deal, and I gave them the names of the boys, and I said it would be around this week in 1780. And months later, a librarian from the Providence, Rhode Island Library calls me and says, oh my God, there's a 150-some page manuscript by Christopher Hawkins. It's sitting on a shelf in the basement of the library for the last 200 years. I'm like, I'm on my way with dark chocolate McNuts, right? So anyways, and then I found a lot more. I wrote the book. So I'm on the board of the Truman Foundation, and Harry Truman's my hero, even though I'm rocking my George Washington socks today. My Trumans are in the wash, and I didn't want to do the laundry today. So at any rate, I go to the Truman Library, and I kicked off an event for them, and I go back often. We call it History Happy Hour. Fridays, they invite local vendors. Everybody comes, we drink, we eat, and then the historians tell stories about Harry. So it's a lot of fun. So I'm doing it. The director of the library the day before calls me and says, listen, when you're here, I'm worried. There's this crazy man that calls like every hour. Are you there yet? He wants to meet you. He's like, I think he's got something for you. He's crazy. And I'm like, nah, don't worry about it. So I arrived the night before, and I said, listen, I'm going to come in at 9 o'clock in the morning to work in the archives all day, and then I'm just going to wear my suit, and then we'll go to happy hour. He said, the guy's calling still. I arrive in the morning. He said, the guy's calling already. And he's like, look, do you want me to get security or something? I'm like, nah, it's good, it's good, it's good. So like around 4, it starts at 5. He comes down, he goes, the guy's sitting here. I can't put him off anymore. I said, I'll go meet him. And I walk in, there's a really old guy, tall, and he has a name tag. It says Woody. He was the great-great-great-grandson of Christopher Hawkins, Woody Hawkins. And he's standing there holding his great-great-great-grandfather's letters, bawling. He said, I've been looking for someone for my whole life, as my dad did, and his dad did, and his dad did. And he said, we have some of the original letters, and we can't figure out what happened. He said, then I got your book. I cried. I'm not afraid to admit it. And so we got the Truman Library, which is part of the National Archives. We got them to digitize all the letters, preserve them, so now they're all there. And the letters that I had found, the 150-some page manuscript, I got a copy and gave it to him. So it was really, because that was my favorite. I mean, what's the likelihood, right? So I was so glad I went to meet him, and he just cried and cried the whole time. It was just mush. I had trouble getting anything out of him. Yeah.
So can you explain why it happened that the Allies shut down the Nazi movement?
Yeah, so we're talking May 1945. The war's ending. All of Germany had basically capitulated. Berlin's in ruin, right, everyone? There was a rumor that the Nazis were going to load up on ships and flee to Norway, which was still Nazi occupied. They were going to use the geographic isolation of Norway, the cold weather, and the deep fjords and mountains to dig in for one last stand, a final redoubt, if you will. So the British sent bombers in to blow up all the ships to prevent the Nazis from fleeing. They see the Nazi Titanic. It's the biggest ship they'd ever seen. It's low in the water, which means it's full of gas and people, so they blow it out of the water. It was the fog of war, a shocking error that would result in this. So it's probably the world's worst incident of friendly fire. It's probably the bloodiest hour of the Holocaust and the war. It's probably the last disaster of World War II. It's probably the world's worst maritime incident, assuming it is. So yeah, that's why they blew it out of the water. Yes, sir.
Hi, Dr. Watson. Question about the escape. When those guys came up on the wrong side of the fence and the guards spotted them, why didn't that end the tunnel?
Okay, so they dug and dug and dug, 30-some days. They popped up. Right there's the sentry's boot. Rose looks and he's like, I'm just a few feet shy of the gate. His big concern, the guard's going to tell everybody they're going to come into the basement and kill us all, or they're going to seal the door. The guards didn't go into the basement. Presumably they thought it was rats, and they were everywhere. Secondly, nobody wanted to go in the dungeon because imagine how foul it was. thousands of rats and feces and urine everywhere in sewer. So Rose said, we're probably going to get caught and die, but you know what we have to do? We have to dig out. Otherwise, we're done. So despite the odds, despite the risk, they dug and dug and dug and made it out the next night, popped up on the right side of the fence, the far side of the fence, and ran. And 109 made it out. Big manhunt for them, and again, they capture about half, 2 die, and the rest make it. So, it was incompetence by the bumbling guards. The Confederacy ran out of soldiers, as you know. They were putting 12-year-olds and 65-year-olds in uniform, right? And so if you were a guard, you were the worst of the worst of the worst. The soldiers made fun of the guards being the dumbest humans they'd ever met, so it was easy to prank them. So they were just so bumbling and incompetent. Plus they were starving. Plus they were sick of the war. Plus they were freezing all night, and they assumed it was rats, so they just stabbed the hole several times and left. You'd think you'd look at your bayonet and there'd be some blood on it. I guess they thought they killed rats. It was Rose's face. So thank God they were bumbling, and the role of human incompetence in history, right, everyone? Yes, I'll take one more.
What was the real name of the ship?
The ship that I talked about, the Nazi Titanic, it was called the Cap, C-A-P, Arcona, A-R-C-O-N-A. She was launched in 1927, built by Blum and Voss, V-O-S-S. They're still in business. If you're a Middle Eastern sheik and emir and you want a yacht, Blum and Voss builds it today. It was operated by Hamburg Sud, S-U-D, and they're still in business. Whenever I cruise, I see Hamburg Sud containers. So they operated the ship. The Germans built a replica of the Titanic for 2 reasons. One, they lost their fleet in World War I. They were the belligerents in World War I, so the Allies did what? Deindustrialization, demilitarization, war reparations. Germany lost its ships. So by building a great ship, it would put Germany back in the maritime business. Secondly, they're not going to build any ship. They're going to F you to the world. They're going to build a replica, a better version of the Titanic. And guess what? They did. From the rubble. And Hitler called it the Nazi Titanic. Joseph Goebbels used it for propaganda. They would tell the world, your Titanic sunk. Ours is still afloat. So the Titanic was seen as the pride of the Third Reich, the ship.
Does it mean Cape something?
Cap, C-A-P. It was named for Cape Arcone, which was the only cape, natural geographic cape, off of the northern German coast on the Baltic. Cape Arcone, so they called it the Cap Arcona. She was nicknamed the Floating Palace and the Queen of the South Atlantic. Humphrey Bogart sailed on her. British monarchs sailed on her. The creme de la creme of the world. I'm sure someone from Boca was on it. But maybe Meisner and his monkey, I'm not sure. But so everybody sailed on the boat. She made 2 transatlantic crossings. She specialized in going to Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina because the Germans, as we know, were infatuated, obsessed with those countries, and a lot of the Nazis fled to them after the war. So she would go there. There was even a tango in Argentina called the Cap Arcona Tango, and they had a full tango band on the ship. The ship was so famous that they made playing cards, but instead of like a Jack, King, Queen, they had the officers' faces on the ship on the cards. And I'll give you one last one. I was speaking at Penn on a book tour, and a very distinguished older man came up to me with an accent, and he started to tear up. He said, I forgot about that for the last 70 years. He said, when I was a little boy, whenever the Cap Arcona, the Nazi Titanic, would come into port at Buenos Aires, my mom would take me and we'd stand on the other side of the fence and look at the Titanic. This ship was legendary, and then it would become infamous. So there's still stories out there, everybody. Let me mostly say thank you for supporting the Boca Museum. So thanks, everyone.